Hello, everyone. Welcome to this chat. We have so many exciting people here with us. So from thunderstorms to tornadoes, severe storms, it is full swing this season. My name is Amanda Weldon. I'm a weather expert at the Weather Network, but that is not even anywhere near close to as cool as the people we actually have on this chat, because we are talking to our TWN storm chasers. And if you're a weather fan, you've definitely heard of these people. So I'm just going to do a brief introduction. We've got TWN meteorologist and storm hunter Mark Robinson. We've also got TWN meteorologist and storm hunter Jacqueline Whittall, adventurer and storm hunter George Karunas, and TWN Calgary Vijay. I actually saw on his Twitter, it's Chief Vijay out of Calgary and storm chaser Kyle Britton. You guys, welcome. I just want you to give a little wave so everyone sees that you can hear me. So talking about starting at the Weather Network, I remember when I started, I was put in on my first couple of shifts and right immediately Hurricane Harvey hit. And I remember, Jacqueline, you went out in the field and I was nonstop sending you text messages being like, be safe, you're so amazing, this is so crazy. For all of you, Jacqueline, I'm going to have you start. For the opportunity to be a storm chaser, why and how did you get into this?
Okay, well, first of all, when you were texting me about Hurricane Harvey, I was probably thinking, how do I get to the shore so that I can get as close to the eye wall when it makes landfall without, compromising my safety? And I do remember that, Amanda. Harvey was, I think, my sixth or seventh hurricane, so I felt comfortable with that storm by then because I had built my way up to what was a landfall as a Category 4 storm. But, we go back to the first storm that I chased with Mark Robinson. It was Hurricane Gonzalo, which was barely a Cat 1. So, I kind of worked my way up to Harvey when you bring up Harvey. But how I got into this was I kind of just fell into this, to be very honest. I had a whole other career before I became a meteorologist. Up until the time I was 30, I was a professional singer and performer, and I toured all around the world and singing musical theater, singing rock music, all kinds of things, singing, dancing every night of my life. And so if you told me that I was going to be a meteorologist or a storm chaser one day back in my 20s, I'd be like, what are you talking about? So I decided to kind of switch careers when I was 30, and I was going to go into just media because I thought that would be a really natural progression into the next phase. And it turned out that I always had a nerdy passion for weather. So it made sense. I went into weather, I went back to school. And then one day I was working in my first weather gig out in Saskatchewan, and a renowned storm chaser named Greg Johnson, a Canadian storm chaser, actually approached me and said, hey, would you ever like to go to Tornado Alley and chase thunderstorms? And I'm like, sure, why not? Like, I didn't even, and that's how I fell into it. So that was 2011. And that same year, I saw my first tornado in Ada, Oklahoma. There's a funny story about that maybe we can talk about. And then I met all of these guys that same year in 2011. And then I was hooked from that point on. That year, I also saw some really devastating storm damage. It was the year of the EF5 Joplin, Missouri tornado. So that was really tough. And I really questioned, do I want to stay in this field? Do I want to do this? But that was how I fell into it. I just was pretty well thrown into it, and I've never looked back since.
Awesome. Thanks, Jack. Well, when it comes to you being on the main stage of storm chasing, I think that your duo, your partner in crime on that stage would probably be Mark Robinson and then followed by George Karunas. So we'll go in that order. Can you, Mark, first tell me the opportunity about why you individually got into storm chasing and why?
Wow, that's kind of interesting because it goes way back. As a kid, I was absolutely terrified of thunderstorms, like to the point where I would hide under my bed whenever the thunderstorms came through Toronto. And it was one year, I don't even remember what year it was, but my whole family was at the Toronto Zoo, and the storm began to come through. And so my dad ran us all the way into one of the underground pavilions. And he popped open the back door, which you're not supposed to do, but he did it anyway. And we watched this whole storm go by. So I felt totally safe underground being able to watch this thing. And that sort of began to get me fascinated by storms. But I've always been fascinated by like the natural world. I was totally into volcanoes as a kid. I used to pretend there were volcanoes in my sandbox, and I used to bury whole towns with lava, quote unquote lava. I was a creepy little kid. But I was
I think that's
fascinated.
pretty on par for kids. That's okay, Mark.
Yeah.
I'm sure your kids do that too.
So I was, this whole thing of the natural world. I ended up going to the University of Guelph to study wildlife biology and marine biology. And then one day while I was working at the university, I found out that you could chase storms in southern Ontario. And I thought, okay, this is kind of cool. And I literally, a couple days later, jumped in my car when I saw this thunderstorm coming and chased after it and was totally hooked that day. And that was the year 2000. And about 3 weeks later, 2 weeks later, I got the absolute chaser experience, which is I chased a storm north of Toronto, and then a tornado dropped about 100 feet from my office. And when I got back to my office the next day, all my office mates were like, "You should have seen the tornado. You should have been here. Where were you over there?" So I was like, "Yeah, I know. I should have been here." So that's sort of where it started. And then from there, I ended up getting encouraged to go back to school for meteorology by a good friend of mine, Dave Sills. And then George Karunas, of course, took me down south to Tornado Alley in 2001, whereupon I had my first experience in Tornado Alley with him, and I was just like, "Oh, this is insanely awesome," and that was it. My whole sort of career went from like being in offices and doing really horrible, boring jobs to just, okay, I'm going to do the Weather Network stuff now. And
I love that.
Yeah, and my first hurricane was Katrina, and that was the first time the Weather Network ever had a reporter giving live updates on the spot in a hurricane. And that was right when I started my meteorology in school, and then that was it. That was awesome. And my career has been in an upward trajectory ever since.
Yes, 100%. The storm just keeps on brewing. Well, you're the king of the storms. Let's also go to the queen of the segue. You mentioned George Karunas. Let's head on over to your little virtual box now, George. Now, you just don't get a name like Adventure and Storm Hunter if you are not just out there doing it every single day, living and breathing these storms. So can you tell me how you got started? Because you started even before Mark did.
Yeah, actually, I'm going to correct Mark on one thing. Katrina was not his first hurricane. We were in Hurricane Francis together 2 years before Hurricane Katrina.
You're right. Except it was 1 year. It was 2004, not 2003. Francis was 2004. Yes, you're right.
But I've got this memory. I can remember the dates of all these storms. It's just one of those things that you remember when this is your passion, when it is your life, right? And
not saying it's not your passion, Mark.
Oh no. But there's been so many storms. That's the thing. It's trying to remember every single one you do, but it's easy to, they do sometimes tend to blend together. And I'm very similar to Jacqueline in that I had an entirely different career previous to doing this, and a very similar one. I was a musician. I was working in recording studios as an engineer. That's what my training was. And I got my first real camera in my mid to late 20s, and started to take pictures of like the weather and the CN Tower getting struck by lightning, which happens between 70 and 100 times every year. So that was the real, that seed that was planted. And in 1997, I did my very first Arizona monsoon season storm chase and my first tornado chase in Oklahoma in 1998. And it's been nonstop ever since. And basically I was able to take what was a hobby and a pastime and managed to turn it into a career, hosting television programs and doing talks at schools and chasing all kinds of extreme natural phenomena all over the world, 75 different countries from North Korea to Australia to Siberia. It's been such a wild ride that I can't even believe it myself. And I try not to ever take a second of it for granted. It's just all about being curious.
Yes, 100%. I'm so excited to dive in a couple more questions deep with you to get a little bit more specific on those storms, George. But let's head on over to Kyle. Now, Kyle Britton is one of the newer people on our Storm Hunter team, and you're a VJ out in Calgary, and you often make Mark crazy because of these amazing cells that you see. Now, you have a similar story as well, kind of with George, where it's all this curiosity and this hobby and this fascination that then led you to being part of our team. So can you tell us about how that all happened for you, becoming a storm chaser?
honestly, it's amazing to see how similar our stories are in many ways. Like George and Jacqueline, I also was a formally educated musician. Once I graduated high school, I wasn't certain what career path I was going to take, but I was thinking, I love jazz drumming. That was something that I was doing. But like Mark, I was terrified of thunderstorms when I was a kid. So I guess this story really starts back in the mid-'80s when I was just this little young gaffer running around. And anytime there was thunder and lightning, I would run to the nearest room that had no windows, my fingers deep into my ears because I didn't want to hear the thunder. But as soon as the storm ended, I had to head to the library and pick out all the best library books with lightning pictures and tornado pictures. So in a strange way, like I was terrified of it, but fascinated at the same time. And basically the story just went from there. I was fascinated my entire life. And as soon as I hit 16 years old and I got a driver's license, well, you can believe I was out in the family van chasing storms around southern Alberta at age 16. So I've been doing this for many years. And like George, also very stoked to be doing it now as part of my career.
Take us back to that first moment that you ever storm chased. What did it smell like? What did it look like? What did you feel? What were you wearing? What were the conditions? And Kyle, I'm going to throw this one to you first.
Well, I guess the first one would have been probably sometime after school when I was 16 years old. So not very memorable. But let me tell you about the first memorable storm chase I had. It was, I believe, July 15th, 2004. And the only reason I remember that is because I was watching the footage on an old camcorder the other day. And so I had taken the family camcorder, took my family van, and I decided, there's a severe thunderstorm warning. There's a storm coming down the foothills northwest of Calgary. Is a history of producing golf ball size hail. I'm like, okay, let's go check this out. I'm going to get up nice and close. I was just listening to myself, just narrating the video and everything. It was just hilarious to hear myself. I had no idea what I was doing. I was just driving toward dark clouds. And sure enough, as I'm driving down the highway, it gets really dark and the sky turns kind of green. And I'm like, ooh, this is getting pretty serious. But, when you're a new storm chaser, you just go right into the core of these storms where the heaviest rain and hail is, right? So sure enough, the hail gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And then the next thing I know, side view mirrors completely smashed. I got dents in the vehicle. Tomorrow, so the day after, July 16th, we were going to go on a family vacation to BC in this van. And so now I have to go home and explain to my dad, hey, Dad, I just trashed the van in a hailstorm. And I was like, yeah, that's probably not a good way to start out the old chase career. So that was the most memorable early chase experience I have.
I love that because, one, it highlights that we never want people to do this if they are not experienced. And two, I also love it because, Kyle, I know that there are so many storms that are memorable for me from just watching you. So thank you for bringing us back into that story. Now, George, you have been in quite a few storms, I would say. Either tell us your first chasing experience or even your most memorable, whichever one you think is most impactful.
Well, let's go back to, we're talking about beginnings here. Let's go back. My very first tornado was Lamont, Oklahoma, end of May 1998. The wrong decade there. I've been doing this for a lot of years.
Good times, George. Take us back.
Very first tornado. And I was with a group of other experienced storm chasers who brought me along to learn the ropes, basically. And we hadn't seen any storms for days. It was a dry period, and then one big supercell went up in the middle of northern Oklahoma. And we got underneath this storm, and we heard all these reports of tornadoes. We didn't see any. And then suddenly this dusty bowl just appears in this field beside us and starts coming towards us. So now we have to evade, get out of the way of this thing right now. So we turn around and get stuck in the ditch with this tornado bearing down on us. This is my very first one I've ever witnessed. I'm hanging out the back of the van, kind of like Kyle with an old camcorder filming this thing. We managed to get out of the path of this thing, and it crosses the road right where we had been stuck in the ditch. And the whole thing got caught on camera professionally because just by total coincidence, we had a team from National Geographic with us tagging along on the chase.
My first tornado, my first memorable moment is all happening on one day. And it was in 2011, I believe it was May 22nd. And I was working for a different TV network at the time. And I was chasing with that Canadian storm chaser, Greg Johnson, I told you about. And I was in his truck, and we saw this rotating wall cloud. It was just around dusk, and we're on a kind of a side, not entirely a country road. It was lined by trees. It was near a town, near Ada, Oklahoma. And all of a sudden we saw this rotating. I had no idea what I was looking for yet, because I was only in like my second year of school for meteorology, and I was learning a lot. And this was perhaps about to be my first tornado. And we're watching it, we're seeing it rotating, I'm getting it. And then all of a sudden, this beautiful, large cone tornado reveals itself on the road, and it's right in front of me. And all I can remember is thinking that kind of like pinch me moment, is this real? Because it looked almost like a skyscraper. It almost looked like this big, tall building to me coming down the street. And it looked like it was coming at us down the road we were on, but the actual motion of the storm was kind of crossing the road, and we weren't in any danger. But I just remember the sheer size of it, and just like, whoa, this is real. This is what this is. And it was exhilarating, and I really wasn't scared. I was just fascinated. What's interesting about that story is we were on the side of the road, and we parked in a way that our headlights were facing oncoming traffic, basically. And I don't know why Greg, to this day, I don't know why he parked like that, but we were parked this way. And so there's other chasers lining up on the road parking this way, so our headlights are facing them. Well, it turns out that other group of storm chasers was actually Mark Robinson and the Weather Network team.
I can't remember the exact circumstances of the first storm, but what I do remember is the second hurricane that I ever did, because that was the first time I'd really done anything for the Weather Network in terms of doing anything on air. I'd given them footage, et cetera, but it was 2005, and I wanted to go down to see this hurricane that we'd been watching, and George Karunas was on his way down. And I was like, oh man, I really want to go. But of course, I'm a student, so I have no money. So I contacted the Weather Network, said, guys, can you throw me some money for some footage so I can go down? And little did I know that day, all the Weather Network people were at a picnic or something. So George, off he goes on. He's like, dude, I gotta go, man. I'm sorry, I gotta go. I mean, he's very mercenary that way. He doesn't really care about his friends at all. So I'm like,
grabs a baguette and leaves.
Yeah. So I'm like, oh, what am I going to do? And then about 4 hours later, I get this call from the news director at the time saying, so where are you? And I'm like, give me a minute. I grab the phone, I phone George. He's like, wait, man, I'm coming. He's like, dude, I'm like almost in line to cross the border. It's like, if you were 2 minutes later than this, I would have crossed the border and left you behind. I'm like, wait. So I took my old beat up Blazer, which I don't think Jacqueline ever saw that. Car, it was the worst car. And I went down, I drove Toronto to Windsor in like 3.5 hours. There was smoke pouring out of the back of this thing. George was stuck at my in-laws for 3 hours. Poor him. I feel bad about that. So we then drive all the way from there, all the way down to Gulfport, Mississippi. And the one thing I remember distinctly is that we are driving south. We're almost to the actual border itself, or to the beach itself, and we're talking to a very well-known hurricane chaser who sadly passed away now, Jim Leonard, and Jim says, he goes, dude, do not go south of I-10. And I'm talking to him, and literally I'm going, what? And I said, see I-10 pass like this as George and I go by it. And he's like, don't go south of that. This thing's going to be bad. And George's like, no, man, we'll be fine. He's like, right over there. And I'm like, we're going to die. This is it. I'm going to die in this hurricane. And I remember George and I actually being in the parking garage, watching this, come at us, and watching this thing hit Category 5.
In the world of Twister, you've got Bill Paxton, Helen Hunt getting in the middle of that storm. What are some of the most misconceptions when it comes to storm chasing? And I'm just going to throw this out as a panel, so whoever knows goes first.
I'll take that one, because I actually think there's a lot about Twister that was done very well and very accurately, and I can speak to one example of that. It's obviously dated, and things are a lot slicker now, and it was a movie, but do you know that scene where they're like holding on to the pipe and they're like vertical, in the winds and in the tornado? everybody would look at that and be like, oh, come on, that's Hollywood. Would that really happen? I can verify that it absolutely does happen. I interviewed a lady in Joplin, Missouri, after the EF5 tornado went through that town. And that was my first damage path I'd ever been in. And I'd only been a chaser for a week. So I had seen my first tornado in Ada, and a week later I was in the center of absolute destruction. 180 some odd people died. I saw bodies being pulled from wreckage. It was one of the hardest things I've ever had to cover. And there, I spoke to a lady that was in her house, and her daughter was in town, and they were trying to communicate. One of her daughters was in town. They were trying to communicate via phone, and her one daughter were in the bathroom in the center point of their home, which is a great spot to be in a tornado when you don't have a basement. So they were doing the right thing, and the tornado ripped the entire home off of it, like ripped all the walls, and everything was gone. And she remembers she was on the phone when this was all happening with her other daughter that was in town. Tornado rips through. She's trying to talk to her daughter, screaming, debris, wind. You can imagine what she was going through. And her daughter held on to the pipes in the bathroom, the actual piping, the water pipes. And the only thing that was keeping the mom, who I interviewed, on the ground was those pipes. So her daughter was holding the pipes, and she was holding her mom, who was vertical in the air. And her mom was on the phone trying to talk to her other daughter, and they thought, that's it, we're dead, this is not, and literally vertical in the air. We've also seen some really crazy stuff, like, I know, Mark, you and I remember that time where half of the home was ripped away from a tornado, and the ketchup bottle and the salt and pepper are still exactly where they are on the counter, and the canned goods are all lined up. Really interesting stuff. So Twister, there was a lot that wasn't accurate, but there were moments that were accurate.
The biggest misconception I think that Twister has is that you actually see tornadoes when you're storm chasing. Honestly, it's not easy.
Often you think of like being near big, dangerous storms. You've got hazards like tornadoes, hail, lightning. Lightning is a big one because you're out with metal tripods, with your camera out in a field. I'm just surprised we don't have more lightning incidents with chasers. But I'd say one of the bigger misconceptions surrounding these storms is that the actual greatest threat in most cases is not the storm and the hazards itself. It's the environment around the storm. It's basically driving.
What about the rest of you? Have you ever been in a situation that's been too close to call, like too close for comfort? George is like counting on his fingers.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Which one?
Well, okay, George, we'll take you first, and then Jack, you had one locked and loaded there too. George?
Yeah, lots of times. I've had lightning strike so close that I've felt the heat on my face and seen the sparks coming up off the ground. I had a tornado form beside me in Nebraska and push over a farmer's irrigation pivot and smash the windshield of the car that I was driving. It's just many different encounters. I've had tornadoes that have been so close, and at night, where the flying debris has been like driving through a swarm of bees, with power flashes all around you of transformers and power lines exploding, and you're seeing these blue sparks right beside your vehicle. And those are just the obvious hazards. As Kyle was talking about, there's all the other stuff. And you mentioned driving. That is absolutely the number one thing. But I've had bad encounters with rattlesnakes, fire ants, food poisoning, farmers with guns, like all this weird stuff that you can't even imagine you're going to encounter out there also become a threat.
So we've established that if you're a storm hunter, your spirit animal has to be a cat, because you are required to have at least 9 lives to get through it.
At least, I think 7 so far.
You better keep him safe, Jacqueline. Let's go over to you. Any situations too close to call?
I can't. I've given up trying to keep George Curtis safe. There's no. He's always the one saying, no, we're fine. We're fine, Jack. We're fine. Keep going.
Save the drama for his mama.
Exactly. No, George is a very safe chaser. I don't want to sound like he takes risks that he shouldn't, but he definitely pushes me beyond my limits, which is good. And it always turned out fine so far. I have had a couple times. One was with Mark. It was on the El Reno tornado day, which happened in 2013. George was north of that storm. He saw the tornado. We didn't see the tornado, or we didn't think we were seeing the tornado. It turned out that we were on a country road going south, and every other chaser was also on that same country road. We waited in a parking lot playing cards and goofing around till like 5 o'clock in the afternoon for initiation, and we finally start to see stuff pop. And the first cell we saw, we went after, and that ended up putting down the world's largest, widest ever recorded tornado in history. And we were half a mile away or so from it on that country road, and we didn't know this. We just saw a big mess of rain and this big massive storm that looked really impressive, had that kind of spaceship look to it, but we didn't know what we were looking at. And then all of a sudden we saw the storm. So if we're coming down south, the storm is on the left side or the west side of that road. And that storm was looking like it was moving toward us, and we could feel inflow being sucked up into the storm. And we were like, well, this is getting really scary. And everybody had that same, oh no, this is getting scary. And we'd heard reports of a tornado from George over the radio at a different location. So we thought we better move. Everybody thought we better move at that same time. And now you have hundreds of chasers trying to flee what is now the largest tornado ever. And none of us know this, and we're trying to get south on that country road, and all we see is brake light, brake light, brake light, brake light. And I can see the storm. I've got the old camera hanging out the window shooting this massive storm, not really knowing what it was inside. I see these people get into their storm shelter, like open the door and get down, and I'm like, oh boy, we got to get out of here fast. And we couldn't, there was so much traffic. That storm ended up crossing the highway just north of where we are, unfortunately killed some storm chasers that day, prominent ones, some of the best, some of the safest, some of the best. And we got out okay, and all of our friends did, but it was very scary. That was one of the scariest moments, just trying to flee, and then having really no idea what we were looking at. And it turned out that not only was it the widest, but it made all these erratic turns, and it accelerated at record speed. So it was this massive 2.6 mile wide tornado, 4.2 kilometer wide tornado, zigzagging. Like usually storms don't do that. They kind of stick with an overall motion. They can kind of turn right sometimes, but this was just it's erratic. So it was terrifying.
When is it time to make the call? You know, we got to go, we got to pivot, we got to move. What are you guys looking at? How does that call feel like when you're on a team? Is there like a captain of the team who's basically like taking the lead on making that decision? How does it work? Maybe George, you can answer this one because you've been kind of the lead on some of these before.
Yeah, I can definitely talk about that. And one thing I really want to point out is that to be an expert in anything just means that you're able to distinguish subtle differences that other people are not able to see. So if you were an airline pilot or a brain surgeon, you can do it because you can understand what's going on around you, right? So same thing with storm chasing. If you're looking at the sky and you know what's going on, you can read the sky, you can be safe, and you can have a better sense of when it's time to turn around, when it's going to be dangerous. And we're always looking for escape routes and road networks and things like that. So it's all about experience and having good teammates. I love working with the same people. I've worked with Mark and Jacqueline for so many years in so many different situations. One thing that I do when I'm leading other big expeditions, like some things for National Geographic and things like that, is that when things get really into the thick of it, I give every single team member the ability to call it off at any time for any reason, even if I disagree with them. Because sometimes, even if you're the team leader or if you're whatever, if you're so close, you can't see the forest for the trees at times. And sometimes you need someone else to tap you on the shoulder and say, it's time to go.
If I could just mention further to that point as well, I used to be a wildland firefighter here in Alberta, and we used to really kind of beat home the concept of situational awareness, keeping your head on a swivel. And you're always kind of trying to think, be 2 steps ahead, because you have to understand how the storm works, but you also have to think just big picture around the storm, working around these storms, these associated hazards, right down to the road network. Like basically escape routes, safety zones, these concepts from a wildfire also apply to storm chasing. One time when we were in southern Saskatchewan, far southern Saskatchewan, we were riding a storm right along the Canada-US border east of Estevan. And this is one of the unforeseen hazards of storm chasing sometimes. You're either navigating with like your Google on your phone or you're looking at a paper atlas. And of course, I trust paper atlases. I'm thinking, well, this is a good map book, right? And you're going along and you assume that all of the roads, your safety, your escape routes away from the storm, if something goes wrong, are going to be there for you. And then suddenly, you're going along and, okay, no, there's a road that goes here. I'm telling my chase partner here in Saskatchewan, I'm like, there's a road that goes along here that crosses this river. And then so as we're driving along, suddenly the road goes from gravel to grass. And we're like, this is not a good sign. And then the next thing you know, we pull up to this river and there is no bridge across. We've got a storm moving behind us at 70 kilometers an hour, and we don't have that much margin of error, margin of safety. We're pretty close to the storm. But now the map book is wrong. We've got to turn around and go back. We got to backtrack into the danger zone, dangerously close to the storm. If there had been something more serious in there, like a big tornado, we might have been in trouble.
So how has social media changed chasing for you guys?
Back in the early days, we had no mobile cellular connections. We had to literally drive to a town, go find the local public library, and use one of their computers to look at the forecast and to look at the computer models and the satellite imagery. And then we'd get back in the car and you're blind after that, just whatever you see in the sky. And if you're overcast on a day like that, there's nothing to see. So in the early days, you had to be a better forecaster and you had to be a really much better storm chaser, because now everybody has got the world's information in the palm of their hand, along.
Or they did have it in their hand.
-1. But there's also a camera in there, right? So now more people are able to do it, and they're able to capture in high definition 4K video all of these things that we would work really, really hard to get to. And as great as social media is, and I love it, it can be really disheartening because there's no way that you can compete with 1,000 other people who happen to be there with their camera. And on social media, you'll have your picture that you took, and then you look and you'll see there's always going to be something better.
Yeah.
Because there's so many cameras out there. So in the world of social media these days, storm chasing has become, the key really is to go from disappointment to disappointment without losing enthusiasm.
Comparison is the thief of joy, George.
Exactly.
Well,
absolutely. Comparison is absolutely the thief of joy. So I like to post things on social media a lot more than I consume social media. I try to be more of a producer than a consumer, and it's much better for the mental health when there's so many great photos out there of stuff that you were just so close but didn't quite catch.
Oh, if I had a nickel for every time Mark and I are in a car going, oh, that was awesome, right on, high five, oh, that was amazing. And then we're like an hour later, oh man, look what they got. Oh, wow, that's better, eh? Yeah, we suck, it's just how it happens.
So for the definitions, storm chasing versus storm spotting, can someone just answer this question for me? What's the difference?
Storm spotters basically are just in a certain location. They're often trained. They've learned how to identify certain cloud features just to read the storms, know what's going on, and provide that valuable information back to the weather agency, say Environment Canada and Environment and Climate Change Canada. Now in Canada, a storm chaser is a mobile version of a storm spotter, or it could be many other things. But typically, you're a mobile version of a storm spotter. You can be very useful to, say, Environment and Climate Change Canada with your reporting by just basically sticking with this storm. You have more storm time. You can just watch how this storm evolves and kind of give a better big picture look, whereas these storm spotters, very valuable members of the community as well, but they're kind of fixed to one location at home. They're trained to stay at home. They don't hit the road. Basically, their storm time consists of the time that the storm is approaching and the time that it's gone. So that's the main difference that I would say.
Can I be a storm spotter?
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely.
Yep.
Can anyone be a storm spotter?
Maybe anyone could be a storm spotter. It's highly recommended to actually go, and if you're interested in that, and certainly if you're not a fan of the idea of chasing storms, and chasing, of course, you want to certainly, there's a process to becoming a safe storm chaser, but I would say a spotter, certainly if you're interested in it, especially if you like severe storms, to get that training, and actually you can be very useful to the community with that.
Thanks, Kyle.
And Environment Canada provides that training every springtime, except for this year they had to cancel all of their courses because of COVID. But every spring, usually in April into May, they do storm spotting courses.
The restrictions because of COVID-19, how has that impacted storm chasing, and everything surrounded around the art of what you guys do. Mark, can you cover this one because you're out in the field right now?
Massive effect for Canadians, for any of the Canadian chasers, in that the border is closed. So a lot of chasers go down to Tornado Alley, Kansas, Oklahoma, Texas, Nebraska. But this year, nope, nobody crossing that border. And I know that we've actually seen on the other side of it, especially out where Kyle is, where the Americans have wanted to come up and chase in Canada, and they haven't been able to. So that's like, I think, the biggest impact that we've seen so far. But in terms of chasing in and around Ontario, like for myself anyway, the biggest change is that I'm sort of by myself, as you can kind of see here in the car. I haven't had a cameraman, so everything has to be set up and ready to go. So it makes it a little bit trickier, especially when the worst part of it is that Jacqueline is not with me. That is literally the worst part of it.
That's nice. Storm chasing is so very social. It's a lot of fun to see your friends. I mean, the only time I've actually met Kyle Britton was in Tornado Alley. Isn't that funny, Kyle? I don't think we've ever met in person other than that day on the side of the car there. Is that true?
Yeah, I'm super envious of all you guys out in Ontario there to get to chase together all the time. But it was great to meet you guys down in Tornado Alley for sure.
George, what are you missing the most about storm chasing this year?
A lot of what I do is international. So my wings have been clipped, and basically it's come to a screeching halt. Mm-hmm. And I've had so many trips canceled already this year. I was supposed to have just gotten back from Iceland. I had volcano expeditions planned in various places, and Tornado Alley trip this year was canceled. So it's been particularly difficult for me, but it's Mother Nature. So it's not like I'm not used to Mother Nature giving me a hard time, you know? It's just I'm not used to it lasting quite this long, though.
You'll appreciate it more than ever.
I'm just itching to get on a plane and get back out there as soon as it's safe to do so.
With everything like this currently, Jacqueline, you already mentioned how some things have evolved because of everything. You have to innovate, you have to move with things. How do you think that this world of the traditional storm tracking is going to evolve after now experiencing this close down?
Everybody will be a little bit more on guard. You know, maybe when you're on the side of the road in Oklahoma or Alberta, maybe you're going to be wearing a mask, you know, for a long time. For a long time. I don't know. I tend to think that a lot of this will get back to kind of close to where it was. So I don't know how much of an impact it's going to have on storm chasing, because generally when you're storm chasing, you are like with that group in the car, and you might hang out that night at dinner, but you're kind of isolated to your little group pretty much. But I think there'll be a lot more hand washing. There'll be hand sanitizer. I'm kind of the mom of the car. So I'm always like, they get mad at me because I'll get like an air freshener or something from the car because it stinks like bad storm chasing stinks. And then they'll be like, oh, that's so strong. Why did you bring that in there? And anyway, so I'm always like the mom. So I'll probably have more wipes and more hand sanitizer with me in future trips.
My gosh. Jacqueline, I love that you mentioned that too. So I'm going to bounce a question right back to you. You know, we are in a group of men here as we're talking on the panel. And I look up to you so much being a female in this field and pushing through that boundary, because as we talk about things changing, you know what, there's still a lot of things to change in every industry when it comes to including women. What would you say has been your experience so far being a female in this field and even breaking into it as a female? How is that received?
Well, when I think about when I started chasing back in around 2011, there were certainly a lot less women doing what we're doing now. There's definitely more women doing it, which is fantastic to see. But I gotta say, like, honestly, it was never even an issue for me. Like, I never felt like I didn't belong. I guess I've kind of always been that woman or girl in my past that doesn't mind getting her hands dirty, and I can kind of hang with the guys, and you do need to be able to hang with the guys. But there's lots of girl chasers, women chasers out there that hang with the girls and are just a female chase group. I've never been in that scene. I can only imagine how fun that would be, you know, and not to be stereotypical, but you know that the conversation is going to be far different than what the conversation is in the car with a bunch of guys. That being said, they're very good, and they're all in touch with their feminine sides, and we can talk about lots of girl things too. But I've never felt excluded. I've never felt different. These guys have always just made me feel very welcome. And I didn't feel like I'm a woman or I didn't fit in or anything like that. And I think it's just changing so rapidly that there's just so many more women doing it out there.
Favorite moment or memory storm chasing?
Favorite moment would be when you first see your chase friends for the first time that season that you haven't seen since the last season.
Best place on earth to chase storms?
In the United States, Western Kansas, Eastern Colorado. Unbelievable high plains chase environment, excellent visibility. In Canada, Alberta, and southwestern Saskatchewan. I can see storms in Calgary as far as Edmonton and Montana at the same time. At least 300 kilometers of visibility, very few trees, very, very clear skies, and just beautiful supercell storms. Again, very high plains environment, like that part of the U.S.
I'll take anywhere. Like, if I can see the storms, that's the best place.
Oh,
See,
I love that.
I want to just add to that because I
this
can't
gonna be a trend?
stand. This is going to be a trend. No, I'm telling you, I can't stand chasing in Southern Ontario. It's where I live. Can't stand it. I've never seen a tornado in Ontario. I've never seen a funnel. Actually, I saw one funnel over the lake, but it was like this weird spinny up thing. I don't even know what it was. It was before I was even in weather. I've seen a wall cloud. That's it. And everything operates in a weird, funky way here in Ontario. Everything you think is going to happen with a storm doesn't. And then everything you don't think is going to happen does. And you get these weird little lake breeze boundaries that spin up weird things that shouldn't be spinny. It's messy. There's trees, there's traffic. I hate it. I love Ontario. I hate chasing in Ontario. I look at what Kyle gets out in Alberta, and I know you're agreeing with me, George, because I know you feel very similar.
100%.
Yeah, we've talked about this. I look at what goes on out west, and I'm watching Kyle and what he's getting this season, and it sounds like I'm just jealous of Kyle, but I'm not jealous. I am jealous of Kyle because I wish I was there chasing. But I'm like, no, that's how the storms are supposed to look. That's how they're supposed to operate. They operate in the Canadian prairies like they do in the U.S. plains. You know, you put Kyle in Southern Ontario and he would hate it just as much. I know you would. No, he says no. Okay, well then I got news for you. Let's switch.
I would. No, I agree. I would hate it.
Oh,
Your guys' road grid's all northwest to southeast, and you got lakes everywhere. High humidity, low visibility, trees. Nah, I'll stick with Alberta.
Okay, good.
What's one thing you never leave home without? Jacqueline?
Here's one thing George Curtis and Mark taught me about hurricane chasing. You always have one dry outfit in a garbage bag, sealed, tied off, so that no matter what happens on the hurricane chase, if every single item in your suitcase is disgusting and wet and smells horrible, and it does, then you have one dry outfit that you can fly home in.
Kyle?
Don't leave home without the camera. I mean, yeah, you can download it to memory. You can be like, I'll store that one in the old memory bank, but nah, bring the camera so you can relive that moment for the rest of the year.
Mark?
Your car key or your house keys to get back into the house at the end of the day, because I have forgotten my keys more than once and ended up having to sleep in the garage. So that's going to be the one.
I've heard that story so many times where he's like, I had to sleep in the car again.
Words of advice for future storm spotters or chasers?
It is never worth your life to get that shot.
Know your craft. Learn these storms. Read about them. Understand them. It'll help you stay safe out there if you know what you're dealing with.
Be prepared to not catch the tornado every single time, but be prepared to be awed by Mother Nature.
Well, I love every single one of you guys so much. Thank you so much for taking the time to do this. I learned a lot. I love hearing your stories. There are so many things I want to pick your brain at a later date, maybe with Jacqueline singing in the background and a glass of wine in my hand while we reminisce on your storm stories. Thanks, guys. Bye.
Bye.